With warning signs flashing red that the economy could be headed for turmoil, the Dow closing over 800 points down today as Donald Trump's political weakness, foreign policy cluelessness, and abdication of American leadership on the world stage is on full and stark display. The world's eyes on Hong Kong. Pro-democracy protesters spilled into the streets today on the fourth day of escalating tensions there. It's the kind of standoff in which America used to take a clear stand on the side of pro-democracy forces. Today, it's unclear where the American president comes down. Politico reports this, quote, lawmakers and government officials across Washington, including some of President Donald Trump's top advisors, are growing increasingly alarmed about the unrest in Hong Kong. One person, however, seems less concerned than most. Trump. That Trump is the commander-in-chief makes the U.S. approach all the more unpredictable because, unlike most presidents, he's shown fondness for authoritarian leaders and little interest in promoting human rights or democracy. The New York Times adds, quote, as violence escalates and old animosities are rekindled across Asia, Washington has chosen inaction, and governments are ignoring the Trump administration's mild admonitions and calls for calm. The inability or unwillingness of Washington to help diffuse the flashpoints is one of the clearest signs yet of the erosion of American power and global influence under Mr. Trump, who has stuck to his America First idea of disengagement. Here's the president's reaction to what one administration official describes to Politico as, quote, as close to a Tiananmen Square, potentially, that you're going to get in the modern age.
It's a very tricky situation. I think it'll work out, and I hope it works out for liberty. I hope it works out for everybody, including China. I hope it works out peacefully. Hope nobody gets hurt. I hope nobody gets killed.
A very tricky situation. I hope nobody gets killed. My, how far we've come from a shining city on a hill. And yesterday, at his first public event since tensions in Hong Kong erupted, the president had a lot of things other than the pro-democracy protests on his mind.
And I think we're looking good all over in Ohio, in North Carolina, and South Carolina, Florida. We just got numbers in Florida. We're looking fantastically good. I got sued on a thing called emoluments. Emoluments. You ever hear the word? Nobody ever heard of it before. Now, nobody looks at Obama getting $60 million for a book. That's okay. Even though nobody in history ever got that much money for a book. And I said, don't worry about the rain. Do we have umbrellas? Don't worry about the rain. Umbrellas work very well, especially when they're made in America. I always loved trucks. I still do. Nothing changes. Sometimes, you know, you might become president, but nothing changes. I still love trucks.
The world's on fire, and Trump is musing publicly about his poll numbers in battleground states, his love of umbrellas and trucks, and President Obama's book deal. That's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, Eli Stokols, White House reporter for the LA Times. Rick Stengel, who worked in President Obama's State Department and was a former managing editor at Time Magazine. Eugene Robinson, columnist with the Washington Post, also joining us. Former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, Ron Klain, plus Elise Labott, a journalist who covers foreign affairs, is back with us. I have to start with you, Rick Stengel, because so much of what Trump does is what I would put in the category of stupid human tricks. He says dumb things, but there aren't any lives at stake. There aren't any consequences. This is a moment where every American president, Democratic president, Republican president, I would think, if you judge their records and the way they responded, would be standing up more forcefully in the way that a lot of the 2020 Democrats and, frankly, some Democrats and Republicans in Congress are doing with these pro-democracy forces. The president would be back in the Situation Room, not giving a campaign rally.
Yeah. You know, political scientists talk about foreign policy along a continuum between realism and idealism. John Adams was the original realist. We don't go in search of monsters to destroy. But ever since Woodrow Wilson was president, every American president has had to incorporate idealism in their foreign policy. So when something is happening in Hong Kong, every American president until now would say, we side with the people of Hong Kong in pursuit of liberty and human rights. That was the city on a hill that America represented for people around the world. As my old boss, John Kerry, used to say, people don't wake up at night worrying that we're involved. They wake up at night that we're not involved. And if you look around the world, wherever we leave and withdraw, as we are doing now, We're never replaced by a better actor because there is no better actor. And when Wilbur Ross
said... Well, let me stop you. Is that still true?
I think it's absolutely true because there are no other actors. It's not that they're not better actors. When Wilbur Ross said it's an internal matter, the foreign minister of Russia and China were dancing up and down. Yeah. Because what no one talks about is, because Trump doesn't understand it, he's moving us to a sphere of influence world. That's the 19th century, where no matter what you did that was odious or aggressive in your sphere of influence, we're not going to mess with it. We're not involved with that. That's Trump, and that's what Russia and China want, and that's what Wilbur Ross was saying that we do today. Every American president since Wilson was having a heart attack today, and it's not what America should represent around the world.
And the world you were talking about ends up in World War I. That's where it heads, and that's, you know, in any other administration, as you said, the administration would have developed a response. First of all, there would have been daily White House briefings. So at the briefings, the press secretary would have been asked about the Hong Kong demonstrations. There would have been a carefully written and modulated statement in support of human rights. It would have been considered. It would have been a process. Everybody would have known what it was, what the administration's position was. That would have been stated either by the press secretary or perhaps by the president himself. This is just, you know, tweet this, babble that. It's incredible.
And so instead of worse than that. It's worse than that, because the reporting that I cited cites Pompeo, our country's Secretary of State, who should be, if nothing else, a safety net for other world leaders and countries in crisis. He was, quote, afraid to get ahead of Trump. It's not even that. It's accommodating Trump's affinity for dictators, as this reporting suggests.
His affinity for dictators, the fact that he seems genuinely not to care whether, China comes in and mows down the protesters, and genuinely to think that's an internal matter for China to deal with however it chooses. That's a scary thing to think that that's what the President of the United States believes and intends to act on. But it does seem to be what he believes.
Eli, I'm so reluctant to sort of ask you questions in the frame of the lowering of the bar, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yesterday, ostensibly, an event about energy. Clearly, he's not capable of doing anything that an event is ostensibly about. He stands up and opens his mouth, and what spills out is what's on his mind, which is his poll numbers, Obama's big book deal, umbrellas and trucks. What is anything else? I mean, am I missing anything? Is anything happening back at the White House?
No, I mean, you know, what Gene talked about, what you talked about everybody who works in the building is just there to serve at the pleasure of the president. They recognize that, and that means accommodation and not conflicting with him, not giving him advice that, you know, or instruction that he doesn't want to hear. The remarks that came back yesterday, the White House transcript said, remarks by the president on the economy and manufacturing, which is like as believable as, you know, Infrastructure Week when they used to throw that term around. That was about everything but jobs in the economy and manufacturing. But that's how the president is. He goes on this sort of stream of consciousness, and it's always about himself. He's the central character. It's whatever's eating at him. Last week, I was on Air Force One in the pool when we went to Dayton and to El Paso with the president. We didn't see a lot of him until the end, but you could just tell after the fact from what he said to us on the plane off the record and from the public comments and the reporting that's come out since then that was a day, and that what was on the president's mind was not consoling the people of those communities so much as it was how he was received by those communities. That's what he talked about. That was the first thing he said when he was asked by a reporter, what has today been like? He said they have a tremendous respect for the presidency. Just gives you a sense of the president's priority. He's always the central character in his drama that he's talking about. And that's the same way he approaches foreign policy. You know, there's a crisis in Kashmir right now between India and Pakistan that's simmering, and the president threw out the idea that he could moderate this. He thinks that if he's involved, he can solve any global problem, whether it's the tensions in that region, whether it's getting Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear program. He believes that if he's involved, he can fix it, that it's easy, just like trade wars, he said, are easy to win, good and easy to win. But, you know, if he's not in the middle of it, he doesn't seem that interested or concerned. And yesterday he's saying, well, why are they blaming me for the crisis in Hong Kong? Well, he's forgetting that just a few weeks ago, in late July, he spoke about what was going on there and said, you know, China's gone easy on them. China could do a lot more. They could be a lot stronger, which a lot of people looked as a green light, a tacit green light to Xi to go in forcefully against these these pro-democracy protesters. And that's a worldview of Trump's that we've seen that's consistent with what he said for years about autocrats and strength. His idea of strength, it's hard power. Doesn't believe in soft power. He believes in hard power.
Ron Klain, someone who ran against Donald Trump in the Republican primary, said the moment that he was most vulnerable was when he was outed to have no idea what the nuclear triad was, and that to the degree that he has any shame, it's around his stunning ignorance on foreign policy. What is, taking that, and I take this source's word for that, this was someone who was defeated by Donald Trump, but in examining the moments when Trump was most vulnerable, I accept the conclusion that that was one of them. If you take that and you take all the reporting about basically every insult's already been lobbed at Donald Trump and he's still standing, you've now got pro-democracy forces that, as everyone has said, any other American president would be standing up for because lives are on the line, not just an arc in foreign policy that affects our national security, but the lives of the pro-democracy protesters. What would you advise any critic, not just a Democrat, but any critic of Donald Trump's conduct over the last 4 days to do and say?
Well, look, Nicolle, I mean, it looks like thoughts and prayers are no longer just the gun control policy of the Trump administration. Now it's the Asian policy of the Trump administration, because, he's basically standing there on the tarmac saying, I hope it works out okay. I hope it's peaceful. I hope whatever. And I think that for his critics, both Republican critics and Democratic critics, I think that idea of an America that's absent from the world stage, an America that's absent from standing up for democracy, goes back to Rick's point about both idealism and realism. There's an idealistic elements to it, America standing for democracy, but a realistic element. One country is going to write the rules for the 21st century, either the United States or China. And if America doesn't get active and doesn't lean forward, we're basically, as Rick suggested, just ceding the entire Pacific region to China. And that's not only bad for democracy, it's also bad for our allies there, for countries like South Korea and Japan. It's bad for American economic interests. It's bad for American trade. It's bad for American jobs. And so I think what Trump's critics have to really hit on is the passivity, the ignorance, the indifference by Trump that is putting our ideals at risk, our economy at risk, and our national security at risk. And I think that's the critique that needs to come at Trump.
Elise, let me have you tee up on all this, and let me give you one more piece of reporting from the New York Times. Waning of American power, Trump struggles with an Asia crisis. By failing to act and assume leadership in the region, Trump is allowing nations with long, complicated histories to fall back into traditional rivalries. The more these nations feel the United States is an unreliable partner, the more they will feel compelled to defend themselves. I'm already starting to hear growing calls in South Korea for their own nuclear weapons. That was Jean H. Lee, a Korea expert at the Wilson Center. Do you agree?
Well, I do, and I think that really goes to Ron's point. It's good to talk about American values and American ideals, but this is now becoming an issue of national security for the U.S. When India and Pakistan are fighting over Kashmir, now Pakistan is threatening to lessen its support for the Afghan deal, for the U.S. To pull out of Afghanistan, which is what President Trump wanted. In Japan and South Korea, now they're kind of rekindling their old trade rivalries. They're talking about ending an intelligence partnership that the U.S. needs for intelligence on North Korea. Then you look around, North Korea just tested 5 short-range missiles, and President Trump is still talking about how him and Kim Jong-un love each other. So, it's not only a lack of interest and a lack of knowledge, but the more that the president retreats, other countries like Russia and China, there are countries that are going to fill that vacuum. They're not going to do it in a way that the U.S. wants. And President Trump does have some advisors, Matt Pottinger on Asia, for instance, or even John Bolton, who behind the scenes are trying to make some maneuvers. But when you fail to see some kind of high-level interest and engagement from the president, a warning, for instance, to China, he's saying that he hopes no one gets killed, but he's not making a stark warning to China, you better stand down. Instead, he's saying, I hope this works out for China. He does seem a little bit more interested in the trade deal with China than cracking down on human rights. I think when you talk about that the president feels vulnerable about his lack of foreign policy gravitas, if we'll be diplomatic about it, if there's a serious Tiananmen-type crackdown in Hong Kong, I think that could be one of President Trump's stinging foreign policy legacies. So I think that's one of the reasons that his advisors around him are very concerned.
And listen, I don't want to hold the position, Rick, that having a learning curve is a political vulnerability. We would never nominate or elect governors. We would not elect half the people in Congress, and we wouldn't have elected Donald Trump. But I guess it's the toxicity is around the combination that the impulse and the instincts as a human being are toward autocracy, and then that there's no intellectual curiosity and there's no staff. I mean, I remember saying, I think some of you were here, the day Mattis resigned over his disagreements with Donald Trump on Syria policy was a dangerous day, not just for this country, but for the world. H.R. McMaster and Dina Powell used to be in the sit room on a day. I mean, who's even there?
So, the learning curve for him is just the learning curve about American values. He doesn't know who Woodrow Wilson is or the Marshall Plan. He doesn't know that we have historically stood up for human rights. I remember once having a meeting with an African foreign minister.
Do you think he knows how many democracies there are in the world?
No, and I don't think he knows that democracy is in retreat around the world. I mean, if you look at those Freedom House statistics, every year for the last 10 years, there are fewer countries that qualify as a democracy. And there's this rise of autocracy, which he is aiding and abetting. That, to me, is the worst global affair of all. And I was saying I had an African foreign minister say to me once, you come and talk to me about human rights, and the Chinese come and say, I'm going to build you a superhighway. Who am I going to listen to? Well, of course, you're going to also listen to the Chinese. But those people in Hong Kong, they need to listen to an American president saying, we support your aspirations for human rights and freedom of the press and freedom of speech. That is the thing that American presidents have always stood for. And Donald Trump does not get that and has never learned it.
Yeah, and he won't listen. I mean, that's the other thing. So you asked, where's the staff? Well, what difference would it make if they were there? I mean, I've been critical of this administration for its hollowness, the fact that there are not capable, experienced people at all levels going down who can get stuff done. But the fact is, Mike Pompeo is not a stupid person. I know Mike Pompeo. He's not a stupid person at all. He understands some history. But as you said, he won't get out in front of the president because if he says something, it can be countermanded by a tweet 5 minutes later. I mean, it's this sort of dystopian other universe we've fallen into. It's just unimaginable. Any other administration, everyone in the world would be waiting to hear what the President of the United States has to say about what's happening in Hong Kong. Not now.
And I don't like to give a lot of credit to Republicans who helped build Frankenstein, who now are like, oh, Frankenstein doesn't listen to me. But in that vein, let me just re-up Anthony Scaramouche saying Trump may need to be replaced for 2020. Joe Walsh, another Republican, I think former Tea Party member, calling for a primary challenge for Donald Trump. It's been a lonely journey. The people who sort of knew him from birtherism and people who saw him attack nurses and doctors who went to Africa in 2015 to fight Ebola. I mean, I guess I'll take it. I'll take a late guest at the party over none. But what do you make of the fact that there's even some buyer's remorse among people? I mean, Anthony Scaramucci, there was never a more foul-mouthed enthusiast than Anthony Scaramucci.
Yeah, and before he was a Trump enthusiast, he was a Jeb enthusiast. I mean, he sort of sees which way the wind is blowing. I don't want to spend too much time worrying about Anthony Scaramucci, but I think the point that Gene made is correct about Mike Pompeo and the politics of the Republican Party. If Mike Pompeo is the Secretary of State and one of the few people in this administration who has a little bit of say with the president, who's not serving in an acting capacity and just basically shown that, you're here and I can get rid of you and don't do anything I don't want you to do or I don't like. Pompeo has an opportunity to influence Trump a little bit. He also may have an opportunity and ambitions to do something outside this job in the political space. And if you're interested in being a politician in the Republican Party at this moment, you recognize that this is Donald Trump's party. And you talk all the time about where are the people who are going to put service above ambition. The national security above political advantage. I don't know where they are, but we haven't seen too many people in those important positions actually step up and say the things that are basically self-evident at this point. You see people like Anthony Scaramouche who are on the sidelines, who might be able to get an op-ed in the paper, get themselves an interview on TV, come forward after the fact and recognize what's been recognizable for a long, long time. But the people who are serving in this party, who want to stay in this party, they are falling in line behind this president because that's the political reality if you want to have a place in the Republican Party of 2019.
Elise, I want to give you the last word on this. And I guess my question is just to underscore and ask your thoughts. I mean, John McCain used to be another number that world leaders could call, especially Russia's neighbors who felt threatened. When I worked on his campaign, he was often on the phone with foreign leaders about U.S. foreign policy. Frankly, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, as a U.S. Senator, was the same kind of American leader. John Kerry in the Senate, obviously later as Secretary of State. Who would that even be? Like if you've got a cell phone and you want to call someone in America and say kids are about to die here in Hong Kong at the airport, it's getting ugly. Who do you call? I mean, who would you even dial?
Well, I mean, I think the hope was it was going to be Lindsey Graham. And when you look at some of these issues of national security, Lindsey Graham is speaking out.
Between polishing the president's golf shoes,
exactly,
really? I mean,
exactly. That was
call Lindsey Graham.
I wouldn't call Lindsey Graham right now either. I mean, even though his rhetoric is talking in favor of the protesters, it's falling on the Democrats right now. In terms, Nancy Pelosi had said that she's willing to put forward legislation that would sanction Chinese officials that are cracking down on Hong Kong. The question is, what impact is that going to be? I think if you look at, a case such as Russia, there were officials around President Trump that gave him some sanctions on Ukraine, on other issues, on election interference. President Trump didn't dispute it. He let it go ahead. I think if officials were brave enough to bring some things to President Trump, he wouldn't say no. But again, with the absence of some kind of presidential declaration, a warning to China in support of Hong Kong, I think it's going to fall on Congress. And the question is, what impact is it going to have?
You want to try to answer that? What impact, Rick?
Well, it's going to have a negative impact. It's going to allow the Chinese. He's giving Xi Jinping a pass to repress the protesters in Hong Kong. It's as simple as that. That's the tragedy of it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.